Welcome back, baddies. In this episode of Called to Be Bad, I talk with Reverend Michiko Bown-Kai, who is a minister in the United Church of Canada. We first talk about why language around suicide matters. Then Michiko shares some of their experience with suicide ideation or thoughts of suicide as a child and how that impacted their relationship with God and actually shaped their call to ministry. Later, we talk about resources for those who are struggling with suicidality and also helpful resources for those who are trying to support people who are suicidal. I think this episode is one that just gets better and better as it goes. Michiko has so many little gold nuggets of information and insight that they share. At one point, I talk about the history of zombies and how it relates to suicidality. And I kind of stumble through it because it has been like 6 years since I've studied the history of zombies. But I put articles and a short TED Talk video in the description that better explain what I was trying to say. So do check that out if you are interested in better understanding what I was trying to say about zombies. Believe it or not, we are gearing up for season 4 of Called to Be Bad. I just confirmed an episode with some very exciting guests to start the new season. So I can't wait for you all to listen to that. Therefore, your bad homework this week is to email me, calledtobebad@gmail.com, or text me or message me or tell me in person a bad topic that you want to hear about on the podcast, or any guest ideas that you would like to see in season 4. Okay, well, enjoy this episode, baddies.
Yeah, it's and I think that's like why it's important to talk about it, because people's relationships to it is like, sometimes people feel suicidal and they don't want to die, they just want to stop hurting, and they don't know what the other options are.
Okay, 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hello, Michiko.
Hi, good morning.
Welcome to Called to Be Bad.
I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, and today Michiko and I are going to be talking about suicidal ideation, or suicidal thoughts. And so we want to start off with a content warning or a sensitivity warning. Obviously, this can be a very heavy topic, and I think it's important to talk about what is often relegated to the shadows, and at the same time, if you are not in the headspace for this discussion, please take care of yourself. Maybe listen to it alongside a friend or with a counselor, or not at all. Yeah, do you want to add anything to that, Michiko?
Yeah, I love that suggestion of like figuring out what support circles might help you in engaging in the topic if you know it's also meaningful. I feel like it's a hard place, like where we have the most potential for healing and a sense of wholeness, are often these very challenging places that are best not to go alone. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think podcasts are a great way to learn about new and hard different topics, because I'm not suggesting to like send this to a friend that you're concerned about without conversation, but it's nice to say like, hey, I want to learn more about this. Can we listen to this together? And yeah, it can be like a stepping stone to further conversation. But before we get started, I'm very curious, Michiko, what you are drinking today.
So I made myself some tea. Thought that would be a nice thing. I grew Tulsi, or it's also known as holy basil, for the first time in my garden this summer. So I have some of that mixed in with some peppermint in this mug, which Okay, so when I was like preparing to come on the podcast, I learned that you did this, and I got this mug. I'm gonna hold it up. Um, I was given this mug, and I immediately thought, like, what am I ever going to do with this mug? It says, "I never dreamed I'd grow up to be a sexy minister, but here I am, killing it." And I just, anyways,
I'm dying over
why did
here.
I use this mug? It was just like one of these things that I was like, thank you.
Oh,
But I think maybe here this morning we can have a little laugh.
mm-hmm.
The fact that this mug even exists. Yeah.
Who made it? Because I want to be their friend so badly. That
I,
is so good. I need someone buy me that mug or I will find it somewhere. Um, that is so good. That brought me an obscene amount of joy. I need to like get out a fidget or something because I'm like all excited now. Um, that's so cool. Um, well, my mug is just not gonna there's no following that. But I do really love my mug and it's very cheesy, but that's okay. My mom gave it to me and it makes me happy. So I have a mug that says hugs to you and it's got a little duck and a little rabbit hugging. And it's Susie Zoo is like the illustrator. So my mom was really into Stampin' Up. Did any of your parents get really into those pyramid schemes? Because my mom was all into those. And one of
oh,
them was
Tupperware parties. I think there was Mary Kay at one point. Yeah.
name a pyramid scheme, and my mom was in it. Was invested. Um, which we reaped the benefits of. I'm not saying it's an ethical thing, and I think at the time there was no concept of like this is not great for everybody involved. But anyways, she was really into Stampin' Up, and so one of the like characters or the designs that was used was the Suzy Zoo characters, and so it's a nostalgic, happy thing, and also like on a this is like taking this way too far, but whatever. On a physiological level, like hugs can help regulate your nervous system, just like the deep pressure therapy. And so, um, yeah, and also like weighted blankets if you are not around someone to hug, and or what was dogs can help with deep pressure therapy. Anyways, like I said, I'm getting too much into this, but yes, I am drinking coffee. Sometime I'm gonna mix it up and drink other things, but like this is like the first thing I do in the morning, and so it makes sense to have coffee with me. But all right, okay, here we go. I just made a Instagram reel yesterday that, or I released it yesterday or whatever, and it was like me like POV or on a podcast with me, and it's like, so what's your favorite color? And it's like pink, me too. And then it's like, so did you have a traumatic upbringing? like just diving straight in. But this is why I do the podcast. I was the kid at the sleepover that was like, okay, let's go around and tell all of our deepest, darkest secrets. And yeah, I would go there when other people wouldn't. So, yeah, okay. We normally start with definitions, and I think it would be helpful to specify what we mean when like so I hear the phrase suicidal ideation or suicidal thoughts. Do you have any do you have any words of insight there, or how is it important to be careful with our language around this topic?
I guess I would just preface this by saying, like, I'm sharing from more of a personal place today. I'm not like I don't I'm not a registered psychotherapist. I don't have training. Like I've done the like assist like the mental health first aid training, but I don't think that qualifies me as professional. But more broadly, the term suicidality is used, I think, because it creates a spectrum, suicide being understood as the act, but the fact is that there's much more to it in terms of, like, suicidality covers this idea of the risk of suicide, whether or not people are thinking about suicide, so ideation, but also intent, whether or not people have a plan. So it sort of covers a larger spectrum of the conversation, to use the term suicidality. Like I'd mentioned, suicidal ideation is in particular when you are thinking about completing suicide. And what you may have noticed is that I just used the phrase completing suicide, which for some of us might sound a little strange because, at least for me, I grew up where the language around suicide was that you committed suicide. And more recently, the language has shifted as a way of just naming the fact that when you say committed, it sounds like, you commit a crime and there's negative connotations with it. And so to use terms like complete challenges some of the assumptions and judgments around it. And I know like there's also, because it's a topic that's taboo, that gets censored, that people are really afraid to talk about, that in some of the more like younger generations realms where they're trying to talk about it, they use terms like unalive. And I think it's partially to deal with censorship, but also because it challenges some of those ideas around what it means when you say commit suicide.
Yeah, I noticed that like on TikTok, using unalive, and yeah, I appreciate the broadening the conversation to suicidality versus only ideation. And also, yeah, it's not a crime. And I mean, we can get into this more later, I think, but I think that's especially important within religious circles where I have heard a lot of people relay stories of interacting with clergy where they talk about it as if it were a sin, as if anyone who died by suicide, completed suicide, would be in hell because of how they died. We can get into that later, but thank you for guiding us with, how to talk about it. Yeah, do you have any other thoughts there before we go on?
Yeah, just that it's clearly like a heavy topic, and just the fact that, it's a topic where we have to have sort of like coded language sometimes to talk about it. I think oftentimes people associate any conversation around suicidality with this sort of crisis mentality. I think if you're listening to this podcast, you might notice that your chest feels a little tighter, your heart rate's a little up, because there's a part of you that's signaling, oh, suicide is a really bad, scary thing. And so what happens is then it's harder to have conversations about it that are more just about being informed and educated and aware of what's going on in your own life or your friends' lives.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's helpful that you said that. Like, just for me, I just realized, like, okay, yeah, I, take a deep breath, like, kind of sink into this space, because, yeah, there's definitely a part of me, and not just in this topic, but a lot of the podcast topics where I want to get it right. I want to use the right language. I want to, and not just so it seems like I know what I'm talking about, but because I care about who is listening to this episode, and I want them to feel validated and seen in the language on this, and how we cover these topics. Yeah, thank you for the kind of like physiological, speaking of like the grounding, like, can we be here in this moment? I think it is helpful to, when talking about these difficult topics, to hear, first person stories. What is your story? How are you connected to this? And share what you feel is comfortable and appropriate.
Sure. Well, I just want to thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be on the podcast. I feel like we connected just because we were like, I think our vibes are similar in ministry.
Yeah.
And we were like, so we should do
we
something.
Vibe.
But what's the topic? And I was thinking about like, what is taboo? What doesn't get talked about? And why? And the more that I thought about it, the more that I realized that I have a story that's so integral to my faith and my ministry that I actually went through all of seminary, all of intense discernment processes, my ordination, all these things, and this story was never shared in any space really. And I think part of it is that I'd sort of buried the story and not thought much about it. And several years ago, I think my parents were like downsizing, and it was like time to go through and like clear all your stuff out of your parents' basement. And I was going through some old journals, and I found some journal from my childhood. I was probably 8 or 9 years old, like kind of scraggly writing, but in it, I had written, "Dear God, I don't know if you're real or not, but if you are, I want to go to sleep and I don't want to wake up tomorrow." I was being really badly bullied at school. Like that was like a sort of very intense experience throughout, like, grade one, two, three, four. And so I think I just got into a really dark place. Where the teachers had been ineffective in dealing with it. I kind of just felt like I had to deal with it alone and was struggling. And so I wrote that and I went to bed and I woke up the next day. And I concluded then that that means that God doesn't exist. And I just think about the fact that if I, as like a 9-year-old, had that experience, there has to be other people who at different ages or different stages in their life have also felt similarly that they've had struggles with wanting to continue living and not sure exactly where God was in the plan for their life, and have really struggled with their faith because of it. And so for me, that, I realize now how much that was like an impacting moment in my faith and how long it took to get back to a place where I could even ask the questions. Like, I think I was quite honestly, in many ways, like in seminary before I could access the space, the theology, where some of the questions could be asked. And even then, we didn't talk about suicide directly, but just questions of suffering more broadly. But yeah, it's not like you go to youth group and they talk about this. It's not like Sunday school wants to engage in this topic, and yet clearly it's important. It's part of people's lived experiences. So
Yeah. 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 That makes me want to go back and like read my journals, and because I have one like that was like my faith journal, and I was asking, I was probably like, I don't know, 11 or 12, so maybe a little bit older, but I was asking these deep theological questions in all seriousness, and like I don't have kids, so I'm not going to speak like I'm a parent, but this is why I care about intergenerational learning in church, because children have these serious, real questions, and they want to be taken seriously. Well, okay, I remember wanting to be taken seriously. And how affirming for little Michiko if someone would have, heard your kind of cry out for help and desire to understand where God is in your current suffering. Or that, or how can we create safe spaces so kids know that they can bring up something like that and they won't get shamed or shut down.
Or just the assumption that children are supposed to have like innocent childhoods, and so they can't be experiencing anything bad. Their lives are simple, they don't have to pay the bills yet. So, like I think it's easy for adults to just lose sight of how hard it is to be parenting or to be an adult, and they perhaps have, we have a narrative too that really romanticizes childhood. So it's easy to sort of then not create the space for children to be as complicated as they are.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, like you said, you're not an expert, but this makes me want to like talk to like a child therapist or psychologist and ask like, you want to take children seriously, and how do you determine if they really understand what they are bringing up? Like, I know someone who, as a child, would talk a lot about kind of self-harm ideas, or like not wanting to live anymore. And I think they were serious, and I think they were seriously saying that they were in pain. Um, but yeah, how do you determine if they like actually know? I don't know. I don't know what I'm asking. Do you have any thoughts in whatever I just spewed?
As that also not parent, just thinking
Yeah.
about children. I mean, I would just imagine that if anyone's using language like that, they've learned it somewhere, and they've probably learned
Mm.
that it is language that people pay attention to.
Hmm.
So I would understand that as a cry for help, or like a need to sort of, show up and ask more questions, regardless of where they were at or how full the understanding was of what they were talking about.
Yeah. And like zooming out a little bit, whether it is a child or anyone coming to you saying, I am having these thoughts, I think it can, I don't think it is helpful to reduce their experience to like, oh, they want attention, as if attention is not like a basic human need that everyone, like, we all need attention. um and it doesn't have to be this like superficial, like, oh, they just want attention, so we're gonna ignore it. I mean, I think there are ways to kind of distinguish what exactly this person needs, but yeah, wanting and needing attention, especially as a child, is not a it does not erase what they're experiencing, the big feelings that are coming up for them. um Clearly, I have a bone to pick with people who are like, oh, they just want attention. I think it's because people said that about me. So, anyways, confession time.
Well, and,
But
and to label sort of mental health distress as like attention seeking in this pejorative way, I think is
yes.
like a huge barrier to people. They think, oh, I don't want to be seen as too needy, taking up too much space. Like, I'll ask for help when it's actually bad. When really, like, the sooner that you can put your finger on it and ask for help, the better it is. So, yeah, I think that there's a way that it really works to shame people or shut down
Hmm.
conversation. So it's true. We all are human and social and need care, and that comes in the form of attention.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it okay to ask more questions about your story?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm curious, like, if those thoughts of like wanting to not wake up, like, did that just occur in childhood? Has this been like a persistent thing, or yeah, what is kind of your relationship to um end of life thoughts? Makes it sound like hospice care, but yeah, to suicidality.
Yeah, I would say as I got older, I experienced different challenges, different form of stress. I struggled with self-harm a lot as a preteen and a teenager. And so in some ways it's like the mental health struggles that I had sort of shifted in their shape. Um, so I think that there is a way that when you're young and you have a coping mechanism where your brain thinks about suicide as an option, it almost carves a channel. So
Mm.
there's a way in which I realized when I was older and feeling more stressed that, it was like my brain was like, remember this thing that we developed as an option? I think there is something about how that works, but I also feel quite grateful, and I think the healing that I've done, the ways that my life has changed a lot since I was a child, um, I feel like very grounded in a space where I can come and be on a podcast and talk about it in a way where I'm not experiencing sort of mental health crises of the same magnitude that I did when I was younger. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That like something clicked into place in my brain when you talked about um suicidal ideation. as a coping mechanism, as a kind of way out of like, no matter how bad this gets, there is this option. That is like, yeah, my mind is blown. And I just watched this TikTok. I get a lot of, I say it on this podcast because I bring up TikTok a lot, but I get amazing information from TikTok. And it was talking about how coping, like, it is helpful to think of coping mechanisms not as like good or bad, but as neutral, as a way, as a way to cope, as a way to get through life. And if you condemn your coping mechanisms, that just kind of furthers the shame spiral. But yeah, I had not linked that together with coping mechanisms. That's fascinating. Which is interesting because it's almost like these thoughts are a way to keep you going, even though that's like the opposite of what they are. Did that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, it's and I think that's like why it's important to talk about it, because people's relationships to it is like, sometimes people feel suicidal and they don't want to die. They just want to stop hurting. And they don't know what the other options are. And so when you're able to say, I understand that this is one option you're looking at, like, let's consider what the other ones look like. Maybe there's some healthier coping mechanisms. Maybe there are mechanisms that are actually healing mechanisms, or, open up more possibilities. So that, instead of just having this one thing, you sort of have a huge list of options of things to go to. And some of them I think, like, I would advocate for is like harm reduction models. Like, when you're really stressed, maybe it doesn't look ideal. Maybe other people still don't understand what you're doing to cope, but just giving people more options, I think, is better than none.
Yeah. Your toolbox, as my therapist likes to refer to it. And recognizing that coping mechanisms are a way to try and protect yourself. And there's a varying degree of, like, when you start needing protection from your own coping mechanisms, and that's when it can kind of get more difficult. But like you were saying, like, what is one step in the like in like the Alcoholics Anonymous, like, what is the next right thing? Also in the Frozen 2 song, which is really great. Have you seen Frozen 2?
I have, but it was a while ago. So.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, we won't get into a sing along in this.
Yeah, sorry, my brain just I was imagining us singing together. Okay, focus. My goodness. I think your mug, like, threw me off. My brain was just, like, so excited and so scrambled that I'm like, can you be articulate? Like, this is your podcast. Lord have mercy. Okay. Toolbox, coping mechanisms, harm reduction. Yes, that's what I was going to say. Can you say more about, like, harm reduction in terms of suicidality? Like, what that would look like? I haven't prompted you on this, but yeah, I'm curious if you have thoughts.
Yeah, I think because oftentimes when we see people suffering, we want them to be okay. And we have our own definition of what that okayness looks like. So if our friend or person we're caring for is, saying that they don't want to live anymore, and maybe they're engaging in other, like, self-destructive behavior, it can be really hard and painful to witness any of it. But I think harm reduction, if you have that approach, helps you be more present in however they're navigating what they're going through. And so you can be there and just say, hey, like, maybe like, we can try something else together, but giving them a bit of space and permission that if ultimately they decide that they're going to, say, drink a lot one night or do something else, that doesn't mean that you're no longer going to offer care or support in the future. So thinking about that as, like, being the support person as a perspective. But I know that for me, when I was struggling with self-harm, I found it really helpful when people would, like, there was, like, sort of a list I came across one day, probably on Tumblr, that was like, instead of, self-harm, like cutting, like, you can just use, like, red ink and, like, trace something on your arm or do something else so that you can experience release without the same type of harm. So figuring out, however you're coping, like, is there a way that this can be safer or less intense in some way? Rather than just sort of having this absolute, like, I just have to be perfect now. I need to be, like, happy or healed and not be struggling and needing something to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also, it was probably again on TikTok. I heard that that self-harm isn't always necessarily about, like, it's not like people necessarily want to mutilate themselves or physically hurt themselves. It is it comes from a place of wanting to feel something, and also when you would hurt yourself, it releases dopamine. It releases like other chemicals that maybe are hard for that person to access through everyday activities. So this is literally a coping mechanism. This is literally self-medication, and I think thinking of it that way sounds a lot less scary than this, like, and maybe it's because of how it's been portrayed in the media of these, like, it's always like the emo kid and they're hard to understand, and but just kind of painting a more realistic picture or a more human picture of what people are trying to do when they are engaging in self-harm activities, and that can be a spectrum of activities. Yeah. We're going more into self-harm than suicidality, but do you think that is that part of it? Is it or is that two separate things?
Yeah, I was going to note that I think there are people who engage in self-harm that aren't struggling with or experiencing suicidality, but that oftentimes those things can be seen together. Like if someone is struggling with mental health, especially around depression or anxiety or a combination. So.
Yeah. Is there, kind of along those lines, are there other misunderstandings when it comes to suicidality? Or what do you wish people more understood about people who are hurting, struggling?
I think like the biggest one would just be that like talking about suicide isn't going to increase the risk or chance of suicide. I think a lot of people have heard that this thing can happen where if someone in like say at a high school completes suicide, that sometimes it impacts people where then there are more cases afterwards. So that like makes people think that like just to talk about it and put it out there will make things worse. I can't say exactly what is happening with like communities when they're impacted in those ways. It could be that people are experiencing similar stress and grief, and those things just come together in an unfortunate way. I'd be curious about like what more recent studies would say about that. But yeah, in general, like if you're noticing that a friend, is acting differently and you're concerned, that person, I don't think you saying like, hey, are you thinking about suicide? Like, has suicidal ideation been something for you recently? I think they'll either like I don't think that's going to make them more likely. If anything, it just creates an avenue for them to talk about what they're going through.
Right. You're not giving them ideas. They are already there. They are already, well, if they are, they're already thinking through it. And if anything, if they are in that place, you are reaching a hand out saying like, hey, it's okay to talk about this. Yeah, let's go. It's like when people are grieving and it's like, you don't want to bring up the loss of a loved one, and they're already thinking about it. They're already there. So you acknowledging it is one step in the like, okay, I see you. That kind of thing. Yeah, that's really helpful.
I think another thing I would add to that too is that like people can deal with suicidal ideation. Like some people, it's just kind of like a part of their life, like a very long life. And so people can sort of deal with it in a way where they get used to just holding it in and not telling anyone because it's always interpreted as a
Mm.
crisis. And so there are ways to talk about it where it's like alarm bells don't have to go off. Um, People
Mm.
can have had their experiences with it and share that with you and talk about what that looks like. And they're not saying to you, I need you to intervene or I need, a certain type of support. They could just be sharing.
Yeah, so responding to it. So am I hearing you right that if someone comes to you, that it can be helpful to respond to it in like a neutral or more casual way rather than like immediately moving to an emergency situation to kind of just like hear it and maybe ask questions and not like freak out.
Yeah. Or to feel like you have to stage some kind of intervention, whether that's like notifying who they live with or their support system or whatever else. Like, there's ways that you can sort of ask and judge how well situated they feel and what their experience has been navigating it.
So what is the line like? So like, I'm assuming it's the same in your tradition, but as a pastor, we are like mandatory reporters if we suspect that someone is going to harm themselves or others. So what's the line of like is it when they have like a plan? Is that when you go to more interventionist reactions?
I would say it would depend on the person and what sort of support networks they have and what practices already exist. So,
Mm.
in particular, for marginalized populations where intervention methods could actually increase harm. So, I'm thinking in particular, Black, Indigenous, people of color who have had, just systemically horrific experiences in mental health institutions, um, or with, interventions involve calling the police. Um,
Mm.
Ideally, in those spaces, they've been able to identify different forms of what support and care would look like. That would be more about accessing community resources. So, it really depends on, are we equipping our communities with this knowledge resources type thing, where somebody who struggles with suicidal ideation kind of has a plan for themselves, who they call, how they ask for support. Um, Ideally, that's what happens in like a time of non-crisis, so that if it feels like something's gone to that level, you have a really clear sense of how to respect someone's autonomy and agency, even in the midst of something like that. Because I think that's one of the hardest things. Um,
Mm.
yeah, especially once we're all adults and having these conversations.
Yeah, respecting autonomy in those situations. Yeah, can you dig more into that because the in the kind of interventionist like I'm picturing like yeah, calling 911 or taking them to the hospital or going to some sort of uh inpatient facility that is completely stripping a sense of autonomy and choice if you are forcing this decision upon people. Um yeah, so can you say more about when it is like this has to happen versus can you do this in a kind of consensual way?
Yeah. I think like I am borrowing a lot of these concepts and ideas from like abolitionist
Oh,
writers, thinkers in terms of like how
yeah.
can we imagine a future where we're not relying on the police state and the ways that sort of policing and mental health institutions can be so intermingled. So it's a large topic that I feel like I can't do justice nor claim expertise on. But I appreciate like what they say is that like we have to be committed to all of this as communities. Um,
Mm,
and I see some of that being practiced sometimes, people saying like, will you be part of my support network or do you want to be
mm,
part of my care team? Um, I just need someone that calls once a week to check in to get a sense of how I'm doing, that invites me to do that reflection. It can look like all sorts of things. It can even just say, at some point we are going to choose an intervention. Can you tell us which place you'd rather go? Um,
mm.
Yeah, or what that line is like for you. So that even if in the moment it's very difficult, at least you have the assurance that you've asked these questions at another point in time.
Yeah. So looking at this sort of care from a much more relational, community-oriented lens versus like, yeah, totally going above people's heads and forcing a decision upon them when they're already struggling and probably feel out of control anyways. Yeah, looking at suicidality and helping people through an abolitionist lens, that again, I'm just going to keep saying this over and over in this episode, but that is a link that I have not made. That's, yeah, blowing my mind.
Yeah, and at this time then I can like give lots of thanks. I have a zine here even about it.
Oh,
It's
okay.
called Helping Your Friends Who Sometimes Want to Die, Maybe Not Die. Um,
Oh.
and Carly Boyce, whose website is tinylantern.net, developed a series of workshops around the topics that we're talking about, doing mental health support, especially around suicidality, without relying on the institutions that can cause harm. So the zine exists. It's been a while since they've done a workshop, but I feel like they're just such a great resource. So yeah, there are communities gathering and learning and talking about these things. So.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely gonna link that and go check it out. That seems like a really great resource. And it also reminds me oddly of like Winnie the Pooh, like how they all showed up for one another and like I think there's like a little comic that was like it's something like Eeyore about like, do you need help? No, I just need you to sit here with me or something like that. If I can find it, I will link it below. Um but yeah, just like showing up and being there in one another's lives.
Well, and how sometimes too, it's about how you approach things. So, like continuing with the faith story, my call to ministry actually came while I was like 18, and I was like a youth leader at a retreat and ended up doing a suicide intervention. It was very
Mm.
surprising and unexpected, but like thank goodness that person was able to just like connect with me in a way where they were able to finally share what was going on in their life. And this person was quite young, and I kind of had this sense of like, okay, the next step is to have the parents involved. Like, if they're like living at home and this is like what the support system's going to be like, it's really important that that happens. But instead of being like, okay, well, I'm calling your parents, you know, we continued talking. We had more time. When I sensed that they were feeling more calm about sharing what was going on, then I said, I think this would be something where it would be really nice for your parents to know. How would you feel if I stayed with you and we invited them to come here so that you could share? So there's also ways where if you even if you have a sense of where things need to go, you can still ask questions and pace it in a way where it they're able to actually make the decisions as it's happening.
Hmm. Yeah, can you say more about the relationship between religion and suicidality and have you experienced kind of the harm that the church has imposed with this idea that like if people complete suicide that they're going to hell? Like, has that been part of your, yeah, religious upbringing? That's not the right word. Whatever. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the strange thing is, like, we sort of, like, without ever explicitly talking about where it came from or how or why, like, there's not a Bible story that I'm even thinking of that you'd point to. But then the sense that, if you complete suicide, it's a sin, is just, like, sort of there. And, like, I looked at my United Church polity and, like, was looking at it. There's nothing that says that. It's like not something that I believe personally. Um, but yeah, throughout history, that's definitely been a thing, like especially like medieval times where, if someone completed suicide, then they like weren't given a burial or like they weren't allowed to
Yeah.
be in the cemetery. And so there's this long-standing sort of practice and naming it a sin. And I think about the ways that this happened around the same time as you see the legal system developing itself and naming suicide as a crime in the whole committing suicide piece. So church and state working together to condemn it. And I think that there's this, what I think is naive sense that if you say something's bad and illegal, then it will stop it from happening. But for many
Oh.
things, like, when you say that taking drugs is bad and illegal, people still use drugs all the time. And I think that people still, ultimately make decisions around suicide. And it's not about whether, it's legal or sinful or anything is like the full consideration. So I think it's unfortunate that that's been the stance. Obviously, all life is sacred, and the loss of life
Yeah.
would be, something to grieve. But I feel like, in terms of a faith perspective, I'm more interested in the ways in which the kingdom of God that we are called to create is one where people are given the resources and support that they need to navigate this challenge. For some people, it's just like a fact of their life, brain chemistry, but also, very importantly, a lot of the sort of risk factors and stressors around suicidality are connected to oppression. So Indigenous in Canada have some of the highest rates of suicide of any global population. And, also coming in after that, Palestinian youth. So you can see how people living in very challenging situations. I mean, challenging is like not the right word to do that justice. That impacts your mental health, and so the questions around what can we do, I think, yeah, for me, I'm more interested in a faith perspective, like what is the world that God's calling us to create, rather than where is my opportunity to like voice condemnation.
Yeah. 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 I was thinking more about scripture, and it because of like Judas?
I did a bit of research, and by like a bit of research, I
Yeah.
looked at the Wikipedia article,
Yeah.
where it was saying how like it was Augustine that was like writing about
Oh.
how thou shalt not kill, or thou shalt not kill thy neighbor, like includes yourself.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's why it's considered a sin because it's against one of the commandments.
Okay. And I didn't realize, like, just jumping back quickly, like, I did not realize that it was, yeah, that the church and state, and that it was actually considered a crime. Like, and that's why using the words committing suicide is really not helpful, because it really relates back to it being a crime.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think I was kind of interested in this history and just the fact that like at one point in battle, it was considered like an honoring thing. If you lose a battle, you would kill yourself as like a sign of
Hmm.
defeat. And then at some point, I think it was like the Romans or something were just like, actually don't do that anymore because we need the soldiers. So like whether it was
Hmm.
good or bad was actually determined on like what was like most advantageous in terms of resources for empire. So, in terms of like the morality around it, I think it's interesting how, I could see like a capitalist mindset just saying, actually, we need more workers. So, like, you have to be miserable in your situation because that benefits others. Yeah.
That's infuriating. That reminds me of, and I'm hoping I'm saying this right. I can go back and correct it in the comments, but I did research on zombies in seminary and some of the origins. Have you heard of the origins of zombies?
I'm fascinated. Yeah.
So you have are you familiar with where the concept of zombies? Oh, okay. I thought you were saying I'm fascinated. Yes, I know about it. So I forget where, but it's I'll look it up. But the the like zombie origin story comes from uh where enslaved Africans were coming and working on plantations. And the plantation owners to deter them from dying, from taking their own lives. So the idea was if they died by suicide, that they wouldn't be able to return to the motherland. They wouldn't be able to return to Africa. They would stay and continue this like labor. They would live in the afterlife as they were living in this life, and in this perpetual like not dead, not alive state. And they also restricted salt from their diets, so they couldn't have full brain functioning. And so this kind of like this like not alive, not dead state of these enslaved Africans working on this field is the basis for what then became zombie lore. And then was like, of course, like whitewashed, and it usually zombie lore was used as like a metaphor for kind of like empire or oppression, whatever was keeping people in chains, keeping people alive but not alive. And so it's fascinating. Why in the world did I start this? Because it was relating to empire. Like it all comes back to like who benefits from the death or life of people. Was that at all helpful, or did I just really just go on a tangent?
I'm a huge sci-fi like lover, and so I'm forever amazed and impressed by the ways that like yeah, these concepts help like tell a truth that can't be told in other ways, but it's also horrifying to think about, yeah, what that really means. So
yeah. Yeah, I will, if I keep this in the episode, I will link the article. Because I too am fascinated with mythology and where it comes from and why these stories are so gripping, are so visceral to us, and it's because it touches on true things. It cuts to the core of what it means to be human, and kind of like how mythology can push up against empire, against human suffering, against oppression. That was my connection, was the oppression. And backing up, we were talking about scripture, and then you were just talking about how it benefits the empire to keep people alive.
Well, just that we can see that the ways that we some of the language around sin and criminality within those choices are very much based on cultural context, but also with who has power and is able to deem something good or wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And it's obviously a very tragic thing to lose a life, and so I'm not here to like sort of negate or downplay any of those ways in which, you know, I think the attempts, you know, to call it a crime or to say it's a sin is like to say it's a bad thing. But I think there's a way of naming it as, you know, something horrible without, you know, lacing it with judgment. I think that's really important.
Right. There's no question that it's not tragic. And that doesn't mean that it is bad or sinful, or there is something inherently wrong or disturbed about people who struggle with suicidality, or it's reminding me, like, I've heard that people often have like intrusive thoughts about ending their life, and like it reminds me of like our OCD episode where Katie talked about like you can allow these thoughts to come in and allow them to go, and it doesn't have to be a reflection on who you are at your core. These thoughts don't determine your worth. They just are. But that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be that it couldn't be troubling to experience these kind of intrusive thoughts, and that you don't deserve, you know, like you absolutely deserve to seek help if they are bothering you. man, if I ever wondered that if I didn't have ADHD, this is just absolutely showing me like my ADHD is smacking me in the face today. Oh, I know what I was going to ask. So I've heard this this kind of response to losing a loved one by suicide, that there's kind of this narrative of that it's a selfish choice, or that it's like the easy way out. Why in the world do we, where does that come from? Why would we label that? Like, is that just come from a deep well of pain that you almost move to blame? Yeah. Have you heard that commentary?
Yeah, unfortunately. I think most of us have. And I think that it makes it harder when you're struggling to ask for help, because you just already can hear the sort of assumptions or judgment that might be surrounding it. I think that it comes from a place of misinformation, though, about mental illness and how people, are struggling.
Do you have any kind of, I mean, we talked about like building community support and viewing, like helping people with suicidality from a kind of structural perspective. Do you have any other practical ways of showing up in someone's life who is struggling with this or living through? I don't know. Yeah.
I think that whenever people ask about like, how do you deal with a problem? I'm always just like, try to figure out a way to deal with it when it's not a problem.
Ooh, yeah.
If there's a way that you can just be very like public about like, I am capable of having conversations about this, I'm willing and open, then that lets people know. If you're just someone that carries yourself through the world with that perspective, people notice, and that matters. And so if you're able to have conversations earlier, if you're able to share resources, that's sort of like a really nice option, instead of saying like, what do you do when it's a crisis? Because you always feel a little bit more limited in terms of what's possible. What I will say though is, because I think that is a fear for a lot of us, is that someone will ask us for help and we'll feel under-resourced, or like not properly equipped. Would just be like, presence is so important. And so just be able to say, I actually don't know what to say, or I don't feel very experienced, I don't know, but I'm here and I care about you. So we'll start there. And to know that ultimately it's not going to be up to you. Like, someone that's going through their own thing, they're going to have to go on their own journey to figure out what life looks like for them that makes sense. And so your job is to be the witness and support and to accompany them, but not to be the fixer or to come up with all the solutions. And I think it's important to not put that pressure on ourselves. One, because it like can really feel hard on us, or two, because it can cause you to behave in ways that are actually not helpful. Yeah, just to be aware that there are lots of other resources, and so if somebody says something to you, like, just to figure out what the other options are. And even if you do have to, like, call or talk to another friend and just say, I know you know more about this than I do, what's the next step? Yeah.
Yeah, the attempts to kind of fix a situation or a person that can actually cause more harm. I mean, we talk in like from a pastoral perspective about how your job is to love, not to fix. And by love, I don't mean like kind of the evangelical like loving on people. I mean like truly like honoring someone and being there. And we talk in grief work how it's less about what you say, it's more about showing up, it's more about being there. And I hear that reflected in ways to help people. And kind of from a secondary trauma perspective, like those of us in care professions, helping professions, or anyone, who has a friend or a loved one that is struggling with this, like, it is important that you care for yourself also. Like that you don't expend so much energy in trying to help or fix someone else that you lose sight of yourself. Yeah, and really, were you gonna jump in there?
Yeah, I was just gonna say because Carly's work has a great insight around that, around boundary
Mm.
setting when doing support, and I love the way that they explained like when you're able to say no to a request, like sometimes you just can't do it all. And like sometimes the demands are too high. But when you're able to like set a boundary of what you're available for in terms of support, that's trust building. Because then they know that
Mm.
when they're asking that you're giving because you want to and because you can. And that's actually a helpful thing for people to have. And that the thing within the setting the boundary is being able to say like, no, I can't do that, but can I do this? Like, no, I can't stay with you all night, but can I call your friend and see if they're able to come here? To
Yes.
continue the problem solving while setting your boundary. So, yeah, I thought that
Mm.
was a helpful point.
Yeah, that is brilliant. That boundary setting actually shows that you care and you're going to show up in within your own capacity for what is going on. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, is there anything else that you want to touch on before we wrap up our conversation? Any part that we didn't hit?
Yeah, I'm still reflecting theologically on my own story in terms
Oh
of like
yeah.
the experience I had as a young child, how I was called to ministry in like a moment relating to suicidality. I think for me personally, like this year, I was reflecting on this. It actually came up around Easter, and I thought about how um, in some ways my experience with suicidality has been about like it's there's a death that has happened because when I didn't die, like the concept I had of God as an intervener also died. And I thought that meant God wasn't real, but what it actually meant was that I had to develop a relationship with a God who is a God of solidarity, who's a God of witness, who is a God that like respects agency, like that I actually have a life that I'm going to live for myself. And so now I have a relationship with God that feels so much more full. And yeah, I feel for a lot of us who experience the death of our relationship with God and who sit a long time in that Holy Saturday space. And I guess like my hope is that this conversation or others that are, inspired around this topic can help people find also resurrection.
Mm. Yeah. Oh my goodness. This is so brilliant and so helpful. And yeah, I'm connecting that to Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Sunday. Um, yeah, that's profound. I always feel funny because I like end the episodes with blessings, but I feel like what you said is the blessing. So I don't feel like, well, and now I need to give a blessing over top of that because that was just gorgeous. Um, but yeah, maybe I could just reiterate what you just said. Well, Michiko, would it be okay if I bless you and all of our listeners out there as we leave this episode?
That sounds like a wonderful idea.
Michiko and all of you baddies out there, may you go from this episode knowing that you are held and seen. Know that if you are struggling, if you are suffering, there is hope, there is resurrection, you have agency, there is support, and yeah, may you feel held and virtually hugged. I don't know if that's cheesy or not, but that's what my brain said to say. So, amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking about this difficult and necessary topic. I'm extremely grateful. And I know it was a journey to actually do this, so
I trusted that it would come together at the right time, the right place, and yeah, hopefully there'll be even just one listener that also, whatever nugget of this podcast lands with them is what they needed at the right time. So
Yeah. And just like affirm like the work that you are doing to say, yeah, I am showing up. I am like you very much have this like non-anxious presence of that people could come to you and like say anything and you'd be like, okay, yeah. And like I will accompany you in this to within my own capacity and boundaries.
yeah, I think that was the call. Like that was like the piece where like I kind of realized that like I'm just a human and it's just me and like I'm the conduit for God and the spirit moving through the space. So it's like I kind of just have to be here and also like let go of the fact that like there's something bigger that's gonna hold this. And yeah,
Yeah.
that's
It's
that's
like
been
when
a nice thing to carry with me in my ministry.
yeah. Yeah. I really love the backpack analogy or like a hiking analogy of pastoral care of like you are hiking with someone up a mountain and you have your backpack and they have their backpack. You're not going to get up the mountain if you try to carry their backpack. You each have your own stuff to carry, but you can walk together and that kind of like accompaniment idea. And you're just there, you're walking together, you're enjoying the views and yeah. That's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.